Good Calories, Bad Calories, by Gary Taubes. Introduction. Imagine a man in his 60s, living in London back in the 1860s. He's not extraordinarily large, but he's heavy enough that the simple act of tying his own shoes is a painful, difficult struggle. He can't move with the ease he once did. This man, William Banting, was a successful, well-respected undertaker. He wasn't lazy, nor did he indulge excessively at the dinner table. Yet, starting in his 30s, weight had crept up on him, year after year, no matter what he did. He tried everything. He took up daily rowing, which only gave him a bigger appetite and even more weight. He tried walking, riding horseback, and cutting back on his food, which left him exhausted and miserable. He saw the best doctors of his day, who prescribed all sorts of strange remedies. But his weight just kept increasing. Then, one day, he met a surgeon who had just returned from Paris. This surgeon had heard a lecture from a brilliant physiologist about how the body processes sugar and starch. Based on this new science, he gave Banting a completely different kind of advice. He told him to stop eating certain foods, not to count his calories, but to completely avoid bread, milk, beer, sweets, and potatoes. Instead, he could eat his fill of meat, fish, and game. Banting was even allowed 4 or 5 glasses of wine each day and a bit of gin or whiskey in the evening. It sounds like a strange prescription, doesn't it? But Banting was desperate. He started the diet in August of 1862. By the next year, he had lost nearly 50 pounds. He wrote that he hadn't felt so healthy in over 26 years. His other physical ailments had simply vanished. He felt so transformed that he published a small pamphlet about his experience, called Letter on Corpulence, to share his discovery with the world. That little pamphlet launched the first popular diet craze in modern history. People started banting, which became a new verb for dieting. But it also sparked a furious debate that has raged for over 150 years. A battle between two completely opposite ideas about what makes us fat and what makes us sick. Today, we're going to dive deep into one of the most important books ever written on this subject, Good Calories, Bad Calories by Gary Taubes. This isn't just another diet book. It's a masterful piece of investigative journalism that digs through a century of science, and bad science, to uncover how we arrived at our modern beliefs about food. Taubes, an award-winning science writer, spent years combing through dusty medical journals, forgotten studies, and interviewing hundreds of scientists to piece together a story that is as shocking as it is compelling. The book has been hailed as a landmark, selling hundreds of thousands of copies and fundamentally changing the conversation around diet and health. What if I told you that almost everything you've been taught about nutrition is wrong? That the idea of a calorie is a dangerous oversimplification? That dietary fat, even saturated fat, is not the enemy? And that the very foods we've been told are healthy, like whole grains, pasta, and potatoes, might be the true cause of the obesity and diabetes epidemics? By the end of our time together today, you will understand the hidden history of nutrition science. You will see how one powerful, persuasive, but deeply flawed hypothesis came to dominate our world, and how another, more powerful explanation was cast aside and forgotten. This is more than just a summary. It's a journey into the heart of a scientific mystery that affects every single one of us, every single day. Let's begin. Book summary. For most of your life, you've probably heard a very simple story about weight gain. It goes something like this. You gain weight because you eat too much and don't exercise enough. Calories in, calories out. It's the law of thermodynamics, they say. Fat has more calories per gram than carbohydrates or protein, so if you eat fatty foods like butter, steak, and cheese, you'll get fat. And if you want to lose weight, you need to eat less, move more, and choose low-fat foods. It seems so simple, so logical. It's what our doctors tell us, what government guidelines recommend, and what we see on food labels everywhere. But what if that whole story, the one we've built our entire modern diet around, is based on a profound misunderstanding? For over 100 years, from the time of William Banting in the 1860s all the way through the 1960s, the common wisdom was the exact opposite. Doctors and laypeople alike believed that the fattening foods were not fats, but carbohydrates. Breads, potatoes, pasta, sweets, and beer, these were the things that made you put on weight. If you wanted to lose weight, you were told to cut out the starches and sugars. Meat, fish, eggs, and cheese were considered slimming. Think about that for a moment. For a century, the advice was to avoid bread, not butter. To pass on the potato, not the steak. So what happened? How did we get from there to here? How did the nutritional villain switch from carbohydrates to fats? This is the central mystery that Gary Taubes sets out to solve in Good Calories, Bad Calories. And the answer he uncovers is a fascinating story of ambition, flawed science, and the power of a single persuasive idea. The story of our modern fear of fat really begins with one man, a charismatic and incredibly determined physiologist from the University of Minnesota named Ancel Keys. In the years after World War II, America was waking up to a new and terrifying health crisis: heart disease. It seemed to be an epidemic, striking down men in the prime of their lives. One of the most famous victims was President Dwight D. Eisenhower, who suffered a major heart attack in 1955. The nation was desperate for an answer, and Ancel Keys believed he had found it. Keys's epiphany came during a trip to Naples, Italy. He was told by a local professor that heart disease was rare there, a disease only of the rich. Keys was intrigued. He and his wife Margaret, a medical technician, began to investigate. They found that the poor working-class men of Naples, who ate very little meat and a diet rich in pasta and bread, had low levels of cholesterol in their blood and very little heart disease. The wealthy, however, who ate more meat and rich foods, had higher cholesterol and more heart attacks. From this simple observation, Keys formulated a powerful hypothesis: dietary fat raises blood cholesterol, and high blood cholesterol clogs your arteries and causes heart disease. It was a neat, plausible story. And Keys became its most passionate evangelist. He traveled the world, collecting data that seemed to support his idea. In 1953, he published a now famous chart showing a striking correlation in 6 countries between how much fat people ate and how many died from heart disease. At the top were Americans, who ate the most fat and had the most heart attacks. At the bottom were the Japanese, who ate very little fat and had very few. The connection seemed undeniable. But there was a problem. Other researchers quickly pointed out that Keys had cherry-picked his data. There were data available for 22 countries, not just 6. And when you plotted all 22, the beautiful straight-line correlation between fat and heart disease vanished completely. Countries like France, for example, had high-fat diets but low rates of heart disease. It was the first of many inconvenient facts that would challenge Keys's hypothesis. But Keys was a force of nature. He was described as relentless, sharp, and utterly convinced of his own rightness. He dismissed contradictory evidence, explaining away populations like the Maasai in Africa who ate a diet almost exclusively of meat, milk, and blood, yet had some of the lowest cholesterol levels ever measured and virtually no heart disease. He argued they must be a genetic anomaly. The centerpiece of his career became the legendary 7-country study, a massive undertaking that followed nearly 13,000 men in Italy, Greece, Yugoslavia, Finland, the Netherlands, Japan, and the United States. The results, first published in 1970, seemed to be the final proof. The study showed that the amount of saturated fat in the diet, the kind found in meat and dairy, was a strong predictor of a country's heart disease rate. The men in Finland, who ate a lot of saturated fat, had catastrophically high rates of heart attacks. The men on the island of Crete, who ate a diet low in saturated fat and rich in olive oil, and the men in Japan, who ate very little fat of any kind, were largely protected. This study became the bedrock of our modern nutritional guidelines. It's the reason we believe in the magic of the Mediterranean diet and the dangers of butter and steak. With the powerful backing of the American Heart Association, which Keyes had tirelessly lobbied, his diet heart hypothesis began its transformation from a contentious theory into unquestionable public health dogma. In 1961, Time magazine put Ancel Keys on its cover, declaring him the face of dietary wisdom in America. The war on fat had begun. But as Taubes meticulously documents, the evidence was never as clear-cut as it was presented. The 7-country study, like Keyes's earlier work, was plagued by inconsistencies that were simply ignored. For instance, while it was true that men in East Finland had triple the heart disease rate of men in West Finland, their diets were virtually identical in fat content. Something else had to be at play. Most tellingly, when the researchers looked at total mortality, death from all causes, the picture changed dramatically. High cholesterol didn't predict a shorter life. In fact, the Japanese men, whose low-fat diet was held up as the ideal, had shorter life expectancies than the American railroad workers in the study. This was a recurring theme in the research. The evidence was always ambiguous, contradictory, and open to interpretation. Take the famous Framingham Heart Study, which began in 1948 in a small Massachusetts town. It was this study that gave us the concept of risk factors. It did show that high cholesterol was associated with a higher risk of heart disease in men under 50. But for men over 50, the link grew weak, and for women, it was non-existent. In fact, for older participants, those whose cholesterol levels decreased over time were more likely to die prematurely than those whose cholesterol stayed high. These findings were so contrary to the prevailing wisdom that they were often downplayed or ignored. The most damning evidence against the fat hypothesis came from the dietary data collected in Framingham. When researchers finally analyzed what people were actually eating, they found no correlation whatsoever between the amount of fat consumed and a person's cholesterol levels or their risk of heart disease. As the study's director later put it, it seemed that something explains this variation, but it is not diet. This explosive finding was never published in a major medical journal. It was buried in an obscure report, and the world of nutrition science moved on as if it had never happened. So why did the fat cholesterol hypothesis triumph? Taubes argues it wasn't because of overwhelming scientific proof. It was a combination of factors. There was the sheer force of Ancel Keys's personality. There was the seductive simplicity of the idea. And there was the powerful influence of politics and industry. In the 1970s, a Senate committee led by George McGovern, driven by a desire to do good and influenced by the anti-fat message of the American Heart Association, published the first dietary goals for the United States. It was the first time a government body officially told Americans to eat less fat. The staff who wrote the report were not scientists. They were former journalists and lawyers who saw the issue in simple, black-and-white terms. They viewed the meat and dairy industries as being just like the tobacco industry, hiding the truth for profit. They relied almost exclusively on the advice of a few Harvard nutritionists who were zealous proponents of Keys's ideas. The scientific controversy was swept aside. The new official government policy was to eat a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet. The USDA's Food Guide Pyramid, released years later, was a direct result of this thinking. It put fats and oils at the tiny peak, to be used sparingly, and placed breads, cereals, rice, and pasta at the very foundation, recommending 6 to 11 servings a day. The very foods that William Banting and a century of doctors had considered uniquely fattening were now declared the cornerstone of a healthy diet. And what were the results of this massive national experiment? Since the late 1970s, when these recommendations began to take hold, Americans did start eating less fat. The percentage of calories from fat in our diet has dropped significantly. But we didn't get healthier. We didn't get thinner. We got fatter. Much, much fatter. The obesity epidemic took off at precisely the same time that the low-fat gospel began to spread. The rates of type 2 diabetes skyrocketed right alongside it. This is the great paradox. As a nation, we followed the advice. We switched from butter to margarine, from whole milk to skim, from red meat to chicken. And in doing so, we replaced those fat calories with carbohydrate calories. We were told to eat more pasta, more rice, more potatoes. The food industry responded with an explosion of low-fat and non-fat products, which were almost always high in sugar and refined carbohydrates to make them palatable. We thought we were making the healthy choice. But the evidence now suggests that we may have been doing the exact opposite. This brings us back to the question that was pushed aside in the rush to condemn fat. What if the old wisdom was right? What if the problem isn't the fat, but the carbohydrates? This is what Taubes calls the carbohydrate hypothesis. It's the idea that certain chronic illnesses, which some doctors call diseases of civilization, obesity, diabetes, heart disease, hypertension, and even some forms of cancer and Alzheimer's, are not caused by an excess of dietary fat, but by an excess of refined carbohydrates and sugar. The evidence for this hypothesis is as old as the observations of doctors in the 19th and early 20th centuries. Colonial and missionary physicians working with isolated populations all over the world, from the Inuit in the Arctic to tribes in Africa, repeatedly made the same two observations. First, these diseases of civilization were virtually non-existent among people eating their traditional diets, whether those diets were high in fat, like the Inuit, or high in carbohydrates from whole foods, like many African tribes. Second, these diseases would appear, and often with alarming speed, only after these populations were exposed to Western foods. And what were the first and most desired Western foods? Sugar, white flour, and white rice. The argument was simple. These diseases appeared to follow a specific pattern. First came dental cavities. Then came obesity, diabetes, and heart disease. They always appeared together, suggesting a common cause. Peter Cleve, a British naval surgeon, was one of the most eloquent proponents of this idea. He argued that the human body evolved over millions of years on a diet free from refined carbohydrates. Our bodies, he said, are simply not adapted to handle the rapid flood of sugar that comes from eating flour and sucrose. He called this collection of ailments the saccharine disease. John Yudkin, a prominent British nutritionist, went even further, singling out sugar as the primary culprit. Through the 1960s, he published study after study suggesting that sugar, not fat, was the dietary trigger for the metabolic changes that lead to heart disease. He showed that high sugar diets raised triglycerides, a type of fat in the blood that many researchers believed was a better predictor of heart disease than cholesterol. He also showed that sugar raised insulin levels. And it is insulin, Taubes argues, that is the key to the entire puzzle. To understand why, we need to step back and look at how our bodies handle food. We tend to think of our bodies like a simple car engine. Calories are the fuel, and if you put in more fuel than you burn, the excess gets stored in the tank. But our bodies are infinitely more complex. Our metabolism is not governed by simple arithmetic, but by a symphony of hormones. And the conductor of that symphony, when it comes to storing energy, is insulin. Insulin is a hormone secreted by the pancreas. Its primary job is to keep your blood sugar in a tight, safe range. When you eat carbohydrates, they are broken down into glucose, sugar, which enters your bloodstream. Your pancreas senses this rise in blood sugar and releases insulin. Insulin then signals to your cells, primarily in your muscles and liver, to take up that glucose and use it for energy. But insulin does something else, something absolutely critical. It is the principal hormone that controls fat storage. Think of insulin as a one-way switch for your fat cells. When insulin levels are elevated, it signals to your fat cells to take up fat from the bloodstream and store it. At the same time, it actively prevents the fat that is already in your fat cells from being released to be burned for energy. So, when insulin is up, you are in fat storage mode. Fat is locked away in your fat cells. When insulin levels fall, the switch is flipped. Your fat cells get the signal to release fat, and your body starts burning that fat for fuel. This is the normal, healthy cycle of things. You eat a meal, insulin goes up, you store some energy. A few hours later, insulin comes down, and you start burning that stored energy. The problem arises when insulin levels are chronically elevated. If insulin is always high, your body is perpetually in fat storage mode. It is constantly trying to shuttle energy into your fat cells, and it is constantly being prevented from using the fat you already have stored. So what keeps insulin levels chronically high? Carbohydrates. And specifically, the type and quantity of carbohydrates. All carbohydrates raise insulin to some degree, but not all are created equal. Refined, easily digestible carbohydrates, like sugar, high fructose corn syrup, white flour, white rice, and potatoes, cause a rapid and dramatic spike in blood sugar, which in turn causes a large surge of insulin. On the other hand, fats have virtually no effect on insulin. Protein has a moderate effect. Here, then, is the core of the carbohydrate hypothesis of obesity. When you eat a diet high in refined carbohydrates, you are constantly spiking your insulin. This keeps your body in fat storage mode. The energy from the food you eat is being preferentially shuttled into your fat cells. This leaves less energy available for the rest of your body to use. And what happens when the rest of your body isn't getting enough energy? Two things. You get hungry, and you get tired. This is a revolutionary idea. It turns the conventional wisdom completely on its head. We don't get fat because we overeat. We overeat because our fat tissue is trapping the energy we consume. The hunger is a consequence of the fattening process, not the cause. It's a form of internal starvation. Your fat cells are feasting, while the rest of your body is running on fumes. Your brain senses this energy deficit and tells you to do two things: eat more and move less. So you feel hungry, especially for more carbohydrates because they provide the quickest energy boost, and you feel lethargic. This explains the great paradox of dieting. When you go on a conventional low-fat, low-calorie diet, you are fighting against your body's fundamental hormonal signals. You are restricting calories, which your body perceives as starvation. In response, it slows down your metabolism to conserve energy, and it ramps up your hunger signals to compel you to eat. It becomes a battle of willpower against biology, a battle that willpower almost always loses. But what happens when you restrict carbohydrates? You remove the primary stimulus for insulin secretion. With lower insulin levels, the lock on your fat cells is released. Fat can now flow out of your fat cells to be used for fuel by the rest of your body. Your body is no longer in a state of internal starvation. And what is the result? Your hunger diminishes. You have more energy. And because your body can now access its vast stores of fat for fuel, you lose weight, specifically fat. This happens even if you are not consciously restricting your calories. People on carbohydrate-restricted diets often report that they naturally eat less because they simply aren't as hungry. The weight loss is not due to some magical metabolic advantage where calories don't count. but because the change in hormones naturally regulates appetite and allows the body to burn its own fat. Calories still count, but the type of calories you eat determines what your body does with them, and how much of them you want to eat in the first place. This insulin-centric view also helps to explain the cluster of diseases that travel with obesity. Chronically high insulin levels, a condition known as hyperinsulinemia, and the eventual resistance of your cells to insulin's effects, known as insulin resistance, are now recognized as the underlying conditions of what is called metabolic syndrome. This syndrome includes a host of risk factors for heart disease: high triglycerides, low levels of good HDL cholesterol, high blood pressure, and a tendency to store fat around the abdomen. And it is a direct precursor to type 2 diabetes. Each of these conditions can be traced back to the effects of chronically elevated insulin. For example, high insulin levels signal the liver to produce more triglycerides, which are then packaged into the very low-density lipoproteins VLDL that circulate in the blood. This process also leads to the creation of a particularly dangerous form of LDL, or bad cholesterol, small, dense particles that are much more likely to damage artery walls than the larger, fluffier LDL particles. A diet high in saturated fat tends to produce the large, fluffy, less harmful kind of LDL. A diet high in carbohydrates produces the small, dense, highly dangerous kind. So, the very diet we have been told for 50 years is heart healthy, a low-fat, high-carbohydrate diet, is in fact the diet that promotes the precise metabolic conditions that lead to heart disease. This brings us to a final, crucial point about carbohydrates: the unique role of sugar, and specifically, the fructose component of sugar. The table sugar we eat, sucrose, is made up of two simpler sugars bonded together, one molecule of glucose and one molecule of fructose. High fructose corn syrup is a similar mixture. When you consume starch, like from a potato, it breaks down into pure glucose. But when you consume sugar, you are getting a double whammy. The glucose part spikes your blood sugar and insulin, just like starch. But the fructose is different. Fructose is metabolized almost exclusively in the liver. A large influx of fructose essentially overwhelms the liver. The liver's response is to convert that fructose into fat, in the form of triglycerides. So, sugar does something that starch doesn't. It delivers a payload of fructose directly to the liver, which turbocharges the process of fat production, a process called de novo lipogenesis, or making new fat. This floods your bloodstream with triglycerides and drives the entire cascade of metabolic syndrome. The combination of glucose-stimulating insulin and fructose-generating fat in the liver makes sugar a uniquely potent agent for causing both obesity and the diseases associated with it. This is why, Taubes argues, the simple measure of a food's glycemic index, which only measures the immediate blood sugar response, can be misleading. Fructose has a very low glycemic index because it doesn't directly raise blood sugar. This has led many to believe it's a safe sugar, especially for diabetics. But its long-term metabolic effects in the liver are profoundly damaging. So, we are left with a powerful, comprehensive, and scientifically grounded alternative to the conventional wisdom. A hypothesis that explains why we get fat, why we get sick, and why our attempts to follow the official advice have so often failed. It suggests that obesity is not a failure of willpower, but a biological response to the foods we eat. It suggests that the key to health is not to obsess over calories or grams of fat, but to control the hormonal response to our food. And the most direct way to do that is to control our consumption of the foods that have the most powerful effect on insulin, refined carbohydrates, and, most of all, sugars. It's a radical idea, but it's one that has been waiting in the wings of science for over a century, waiting for someone to piece the story together. Commentary. As we come to the end of our journey through good calories, bad calories, it's hard not to feel a sense of, well, a mix of things. There's a bit of shock, maybe some anger, and certainly a lot of confusion. If what Gary Taubes argues is true, or even partially true, it means that for the better part of half a century, we have been given profoundly wrong advice about one of the most fundamental aspects of our lives: what to eat. The most powerful lesson from this book isn't just about fat or carbohydrates. It's a deeper lesson about the nature of science itself, and how easily it can be led astray. We like to think of science as a pure, objective search for truth. But Taubes shows us that it's a human endeavor, susceptible to all our human flaws: ambition, pride, confirmation bias, and the desire for simple, tidy answers to complex problems. The story of Ancel Keys and the diet heart hypothesis is a sobering reminder that a powerful personality with a compelling but flawed idea can shape the world, sometimes for generations. It reminds us that we should always be skeptical, especially when we hear the words "the science is settled." True science is never settled. It is a process of constant questioning, of challenging our own most cherished beliefs, of rigorously testing our hypotheses with the intent to prove them wrong, not just to confirm that we are right. This book is a masterclass in that kind of thinking. It doesn't just present an alternative theory, it shows you the messy, contradictory, and often political process by which scientific truth is constructed. So, what does this mean for you, a young person navigating a world filled with conflicting health advice? It means you have to become a critical thinker. You can't just passively accept what you're told, even by authorities. You have to learn to ask questions. Where does this advice come from? What is the evidence behind it? Is there contradictory evidence that's being ignored? This book is an incredible tool for developing that mindset. Now, let's talk about what to do with this information. It can be overwhelming. But we can distill it down to a few simple, actionable ideas that you can start experimenting with today. I'm not a doctor, and this isn't medical advice, but these are the practical principles that emerge from the book's deep dive into the science. First, pay attention to the quality of your carbohydrates. The central message is that not all carbs are created equal. The ones to be most wary of are the refined, easily digestible ones. This means anything made with white flour bread, pasta, crackers, pastries, white rice, and potatoes. And, most importantly, sugar in all its forms, especially in sugary drinks. These are the foods that cause the biggest insulin spikes. Try reducing these in your diet and see how you feel. You don't have to eliminate them entirely overnight, but simply being aware of them is the first step. Second, don't be afraid of natural fats. This is perhaps the most radical idea in the book. For decades, we've been taught to fear fat. Taubes argues that fats from whole foods, like those in meat, fish, eggs, nuts, avocados, and olive oil, are not the enemy. They have very little impact on insulin and can be very satiating, meaning they keep you feeling full and satisfied. This doesn't mean you should start deep frying everything, but it does mean you don't need to choose the low-fat or non-fat version of everything. You can enjoy the egg yolk, eat the steak without trimming off every last bit of fat, and use butter instead of margarine. Third, prioritize whole foods. At its heart, the carbohydrate hypothesis is a story about the dangers of processed foods. The process of refining carbohydrates and adding sugar is what seems to create the problem. If you focus on eating real, whole foods, things that don't come in a box with a long list of ingredients, you will naturally avoid most of the problematic carbohydrates. A diet based on vegetables, especially the leafy green kind, meats, fish, fowl, eggs, nuts, seeds, and some fruit is a great starting point. The most important thing is to become an experimenter in your own life. Pay attention to how different foods make you feel. Do you feel energetic and satisfied after a meal of steak and broccoli? Do you feel hungry and lethargic an hour after eating a bowl of pasta or a bagel? Your own body is the best laboratory you have. This book gives you a new framework, a new hypothesis to test. That was a summary of Good Calories, Bad Calories by Gary Taubes. We've explored the main highways of his argument today, but I'll be honest with you, a summary can only show you the map. The real adventure happens when you travel the roads yourself. The true power of this book lies in the details, in the meticulous way Taubes builds his case, story by story, study by study. It's in the quiet moments of reading when a particular anecdote or scientific explanation clicks into place and you see the world a little differently. This summary is designed to help you decide if this journey is one you want to take. If anything we've talked about has sparked your curiosity or challenged what you thought you knew, I urge you to grab a copy. Reading it isn't just about learning facts, it's an experience that can genuinely change your relationship with food and your understanding of your own body. You can find a link to the book in the description below. Also, if you found this deep dive valuable, it would mean the world to us if you could hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. That way, you won't miss our next exploration into another life-changing book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Let's continue to question, to learn, and to grow together.